We're good.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's Monday. I also needed more sleep. So, we're going to get through this, and it's going to be awesome. So today I'll be presenting on trauma and stress-related disorders, but mostly just about trauma and stress in general. We're going to be taking a wide variety of different areas to look at within the topic, so hang on because it's going to be a bumpy ride. So today's learning objectives are to understand the biopsychology behind the brain responding to stressful external events, an introduction to trauma and moral injury, which is a little bit different. We're going to go through some art assessments, and also I'll give you an introduction to ACEs. We're going to look at both, all intrapersonal symptoms and interpersonal symptoms, as well as the transgenerational transmission of traumatic symptoms. And then looking at treatments, ones that focus primarily on body and accessing parts of the body in order for trauma healing. And then lastly, for a social justice piece, we're going to be looking at the importance of multi-modal interventions. So first we're going to look up into the brain. So we have a cycle of competence within the brain, and then we have a cycle of panic when it comes to trauma. A cycle of competence is when you feel like you're powerful over the external things that are happening over you, like you have competence. So you have an external experience, and that goes into your limbic system, where you start processing what's going on. It could be the sound, for example, this hum that's hitting our ears right now. That hum right now is actually going to the lateral nuclei of the amygdala. And the lateral nuclei of the amygdala is telling us, we hear it, but it's okay. Like, there's no threat, you're all right. In fact, if we were need to do something about it, which we don't, it would go to the basal ganglia. So say like you hear a car horn right behind you when you're in your car. That'll hit your lateral amygdala. Now it'll send a reasonable amount of stress hormones to your brain and tell you to do something. You know, it could be that you were at a red light and you finally need to go. And so the basal ganglia, it's mostly involved with the movement of your body, kind of organizes that part, and so it'll have you do something in response to some sort of external stimuli. But say the external stimuli is, say, like the criteria A for DSM, post-traumatic stress disorder. So you're experiencing something where you actually don't have power over. You actually are experiencing something that you feel powerless. That'll go to your limbic system, but it goes to a different part of your amygdala, the central nuclei of the amygdala. And that sets into a cycle of panic. So there's the two. Cycle of confidence. Oops. Oh, shoot. No. See, now it's hitting my lateral amygdala. I'm doing something, and now we're back on top. Cycle of confidence. So when the basal ganglia is involved, it's involved with movement. So you're the agent of change, and you have reasonable control. You have heard that sound before, and now it's off, and you don't need to do anything about it. So there's the secretion of hormones is to do something. But with the cycle of panic, you feel powerless, you freeze, you can't get away, you're despondent, hopeless. It's more of a passive coping, and that's what we're looking at when we look at trauma. So first, where's my refresher?
You know Will? Did you see him? Last night? On the road? I'm going there.
That was brightness. Zach,
Dad?
you used the brightness button.
Is that you? Just me, Mom!
Is that what you were doing?
1 second! In here. I'll be right back, okay? Please, you have to get in, or my mom, she'll find you. Do you understand? I won't tell her about you. I promise. Promise? It means something that you can't break. Ever. Please. I didn't feel good. I woke up and my head, it really hurt bad. My throat was all scratchy and I wanted to tell you, but the last time I told you I was sick, you made me go to school anyway.
Michael,
Yeah?
I'm not mad at you.
No?
No, of course not. This that's been going on, Will, I can't imagine what it's been like for you. I want you to feel like you can talk to me. I never want you to feel like you have to hide anything from me. I'm here for you. Okay. Is there someone else here?
No. 11? Everything okay? No? Is everything okay? Are you sure?
So, if y'all are familiar with Stranger Things, which I imagine this is a group who is.
I'm not.
You're not?
I'm not.
Oh, man. If you want to talk trauma, we can talk Stranger Things. Stranger Things, I thought, was a great example on several levels of just detailing the nature of trauma in a pretty cool way. So, Vanderkolk, who is the writer of The Body Keeps a Score, describes trauma as not just an event that happened in the past, but rather an imprint on the mind, brain, and body, mostly the body. So what you just saw Elle experience was what? A symptom of PTSD. Which one? It's pretty obvious.
Flashbacks.
That's right. Thanks to you. So yeah, flashback. So it's clearly imprinted in her mind, but you can tell, like, with the crying and the crouching down, the feelings of powerlessness, it's definitely embedded into the body as well. It's also important to distinguish between adulthood traumas and developmental trauma disorder. Now, developmental trauma disorder is a Vanderkolk language. He was pushing for the DSM to create a developmental trauma disorder because it's a different population than those with PTSD. Those with PTSD, most of the research is around, say, war veterans and natural and human-made disasters. But the nature of childhood traumas and adults with childhood traumas is completely different. Similar symptoms, which is why it's most often childhood traumas and things like PTSD are so easily treatable as PTSD. But developmental trauma disorder is mostly to do with attachment trauma impacts. Attachment itself is so crucial for the brain's development that during times of abuse and neglect in childhood, it can severely alter brain chemistry. And we have two in the DSM right now, reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder, which are behavioral outcomes of abuse and neglect. Another important distinction is between PTSD and moral injury. Is anyone familiar with moral injury? So moral injury is when someone actually does something that goes against highly developed values. So something like killing someone, and it's usually in times of elevated needs and stressful situations like war. It's a betrayal of someone, of what someone thinks is what's right. And it's by a person with authority, so it's less about feeling powerless. It's more about the things that you do when you feel powerful, when you actually have the capability to do something, and you go against your better judgment in those moments. So yeah, it can impair the capacity for trust. It elevates despair, suicidality, and interpersonal violence. And it can deteriorate one's character because the virtues in which someone has been living by has been broken. And as I said before, it's in a high stakes situation is usually when it comes up.
So often like war situations.
Yeah, even just like perpetrators of any kind of pain or violence, there is an impact on the perpetrator as well. And that's called moral injury.
When you're talking of war, I just want to put this as, or obtain some kind of perspective. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a government mandated war. It can be like the war between two families. I'm asking it as a question, not a statement.
Research behind moral injuries is largely to do with veterans. So government mandated, and that's where the research is. But I would definitely say, at any time where you severely hurt, injured, cause pain, traumatize someone else outside of your own moral standards, whatever the circumstances may be, it could be a cause for moral injury, as opposed to PTSD. Largely right now, moral injury is treated as PTSD.
So, for example, drone pilots flying from somewhere in Alexandria, Virginia, hitting targets in Afghanistan, killing a wedding party of 50.
Yeah, that's precisely the kind of scenario. Yeah.
So they've differentiated that from PTSD.
Yep.
Because PTSD's definition says it must be
You're the
virtual.
victim.
Right.
And sometimes it can be where you are the victim as well. In fact, I think that's the next one. So you see right here, the role, perpetrator, also victim. So imagine when you're the victim of someone else telling you what to do. So like telling you to kill someone, for example, and you end up doing it. That can also be a cause for moral injury. So the roles can be quite ambiguous. I mean, it's so interesting that in this diagram it's saying perpetrator first, which is the distinction between PTSD, but it's also saying victim as well. So how it can impair interpersonal interactions. It would be hard to be intimate with your wife if during a war a man was raping the wives of the enemy. It's hard to play with your children in times where in the past you've murdered the children of others, the children of the enemy, within a war circumstances. If you want to know more about this, and it kind of like a narrative setting, a great book is What It's Like to Go to War by Carl Maliantes.
Spell Maliantes.
Marlantes. So those are some distinctions within trauma work. Not everything's just PTSD. That's a good outline of the differentiation. So as marriage and family therapists, there are multiple levels in which we need to be assessing. Some even take on a complete trauma-informed lens, which is the assumption going in when you're seeing a client or clients that you're assuming that whatever symptoms are happening in the present are some form of reaction to a traumatic situation, whether it be trauma, childhood trauma, or adulthood trauma. So in individual assessment, you assess the degree of impact on all domains of impairment, which we'll get to, and also assess the level of trauma entering into the family system. So if you're seeing an individual client, you can also be thinking about how has the family now been introduced to trauma by having this victim of trauma within the family system. The domains. Attachment. This is from Ileana Gill, who borrowed from Jennifer Boyle. All different sorts of domains of impact that trauma can have: attachment biology, affect, disassociation, behavioral, cognitive, self-concept. All those levels on an interpersonal level can be assessed. So it can impact all types. All dimensions of someone.
Hey, Zach.
Yeah.
The 2 slides ago, that chart, the black and white chart, at the bottom it said for PTSD, the necessity lost was safety, but the necessity lost for moral injury
is trust.
Whose trust is it?
You lose trust in yourself.
Huh.
Yeah. You lose trust that you can actually hold up to your own standards. It's hard to self-regulate after that. That's why deterioration of character was a symptom of moral injury. You don't really know who you are anymore because of something that you've done. It's horrific. Yeah. And then, of course, we have the family trauma assessment. So you're assessing for emotional responses to your IP or to something that the entire family has experienced, and and then on top of that, getting down deep into the adverse childhood experiences of each individual as well. So here's a little introduction to ACEs, which, while the video is going past these, some of you I know already have this from Professor Qureshi, who is a trauma-informed, who always has a trauma-informed lens. Let me pull this video up.
Something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics. Or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America.
So, as you can see, and as Carrie's book, thanks Carrie, the DSM and Family Systems book says exposure to childhood adversity was identified as a primary contributor factor to the still growing list of physiological and emotional impairment. So assessing for childhood trauma is essential. And lastly, another way to assess is through art. And this can be a free draw. This is Will Byers' drawing. Oop, shoot. Again, cycle of competence, just like this. Unless I can use it. Self-portrait, and that can be quite telling of what kind of messages are being sent about oneself after experiencing a trauma. And then kinetic family portrait is another way of assessing, which is when you ask your client or a family to draw anything where your family is they're doing something. And it can really get into the nature of different family dynamics that are happening around some experienced trauma.
I have a question though.
Yeah.
So if you're using this mainly for adults or adolescents to kind of understand their childhood, what are you doing for children to assess?
That would be art. I mean, we'll get into that. But yeah, I would say art. Yeah.
There's no like actual assessment that you would use?
For ACEs, for
not necessarily
children?
for ACEs, because an ACE score is more specifically for adults, but is there one that's more for children?
I'm sure there is. I didn't get into that, mostly because I was really paying attention to nonverbal assessments. Obviously, like, the ACEs score is a verbal one, one where people would have to remember the things that they've gone through as well. But for children, I would say nonverbal assessments, which we'll get into expressive arts therapy. So, again, assessment, and now we're detailing symptoms of trauma. So let's dive into the intrapersonal. So I hope everyone read. Intrusive memories, reoccurring involuntary and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic event. Sometimes can come up in dreams as well. There was one story that Van der Kolk talked about when it comes to experiencing the nightmares. It was a man who was a veteran, and he kept on having nightmares of his platoon being shot down and all of his buddies being killed. He said, okay, yeah, I can probably prescribe you with something to get rid of those nightmares. And it worked perfectly. He stopped having the nightmares, but he found that he wanted to stop going on the medication. He wanted to stop going on the medication because he wanted to be a living memorial of his buddies that he saw shot down. So I thought that was a very interesting, where you're never going to quite know what you're going to get with a client and their relationship to their own symptoms. What if it is some sort of memorial like that, especially when it comes to death. Disassociation reactions, these are like flashbacks like what we saw with L, which that's when we know that there's an imprint on the body because the individual acts and feels as if the trauma itself is happening in the present, which is quite horrific. And part of the treatment is understanding that it is in the past, but the body continues to remember. It's worse than actually just having a traumatic event happen to you, because having these flashbacks and these recurrent memories is an ongoing, like you'll never know when you're going to be triggered experience. Amnesia happens. It can be enormously difficult for clients to remember their story. But at the same time, without verbal recognition of what they remember, the body still re-experiences terror, rage, helplessness, things like that, impulses to fight or flee when they're triggered. So although there may not be a verbal memory or verbal expression of a memory, the body still remembers. Intense or prolonged psychological distress at the exposure of something that is kind of like, or even symbolizes the traumatic event. Marked psychological reactions and internal and external cues. Also something called speechless terrors. And this is when we recognize that parts of the body are actually parts of the brain are actually shut down when remembering traumatic experience. It makes talk therapy very challenging when our clients have speechless terror. And largely it's ineffective, which is why when we go to treatment, I focus on primarily nonverbal treatments. Even before a word has been spoken about the memory, your body experiences it. Again, it's this common thing.
They may not even, so the inability to remember the specifics is one of the symptoms, right?
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, they can't necessarily verbalize them anyway.
Right, exactly.
They're just re-experiencing the physical side of the experience. Yeah. Physical emotion.
Yeah. You'll also find clients persistently avoiding people, places, things that remind them of the event, which can lead to feelings of detachment and estrangement from others, which gets into interpersonal symptoms. And lack of trust in self, exaggerated negative beliefs about and expectations about oneself and about the world. It really changes one's entire perspective on life. And lastly, becoming de-skilled. This is also a Van der Kolk kind of thing that I got from him. Becoming de-skilled. So imagine someone who has taken martial arts. He talked about one of his patients who had been raped, took martial arts, but at the time, no previous traumatic experience, was teaching martial arts, and then was mugged, but at the time of the mugging became completely de-skilled of her expert knowledge in martial arts. So again, it's this shutting off of parts of the brain that happens in people who experience trauma. And this was kind of outlined in the DSM. I kind of liked it, but at the same time, it's kind of prescriptive. But it kind of gives a lifespan perspective of symptoms regarding those who experience trauma. Which I just like to outline, especially like frightening dreams for young children. Context specific happens at around the age of 6, rather than those who experience trauma before the age of 6, which is largely not content specific in frightening dreams. Of course, it's also hard to get out of a child what kind of content was in a distressing dream. Older childhood and adolescence believing things of how you're unnatural, you're undesirable. Good example is Will Byer in Stranger Things, where he's now called Zombie Boy because of the things that happened to him, the community believing that he's dead, and now he's really an outcast. And other symptoms, though, that Will doesn't display is irritable, being aggressive, reckless, aggressive. For older adults, they have negative health perceptions about themselves, how healthy they are, and suicide ideation was detailed for older adults, but I think from older children onto older adults, I think that's a pretty common case of suicidal ideation. Like what the speaker in the TED Talk said, it's 12 times more likely when you have a high ACE score, ACE scores, suicidality. Interpersonal. So you can imagine that advocates for troops not going into war is because of the nature of you'll bring the war back home and into people's families. It can be transferred between partners where there's hypervigilance, sleep deprivations, sleep disturbances, inability to feel positive emotions, all symptoms of PTSD, may lead to a partner's depression. Parent-child interactions where when a parent is exaggeratedly startled by things or irritable, definitely impacting the child's understanding of what's going on, and can definitely transfer that into anxiety symptoms. And what's not reported is a lot of veterans who go into their families and a lot of cases of domestic violence and child abuse because of angry outbursts. It's so interesting that when war is talked about, it's glorified these women and children that are negatively impacted when veterans come home because of the nature of war and things that they experience. Their story is often not told. So, also detailed are different other possible circumstances. From the within a family system, the trauma survivor actually becoming scapegoated because there are relational disturbances that happens when someone has experienced a trauma, and the interaction within families can be quite distressing as well. And so the problems that result from having someone in the family who's experienced trauma and their symptoms, all those problems can be blamed on this particular family member, so they can become scapegoated. Trouble engaging in intimacy we kind of covered. Parents struggling to foster growth and nurturance to their own children because symptoms can be so debilitating. Reactive attachment disorder significantly impairs children's relationships with adults and peers. Relationship between siblings is also impaired, can be impaired. Family support and nurturance can be impaired. It kind of throws the entire family off. Things aren't normal anymore when one or more members of the family have experienced, all the way to the point where it may be hard to attend to basic needs in the family, and because of resources being used to deal with the traumatic event or the symptoms of the trauma in the family members. So things like safety, food, and health may not be of the top priority when family members are suffering. And finally, intergenerational. Now, this is the passage of behavioral, emotional, and physiological manifestations of traumatic stress down generations. Similar to what Ben detailed in his anxiety presentation, recent studies about this particular RSA, actually I'm not sure what the noun for it is, but it's a part of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is a part of the body's part in calming yourself down, the parasympathetic nervous system. So RSA is crucial for self-regulation. Well, the research, it's recent research, I wish I had written down the year, but I didn't. The research showed that this biological marker of infants' ability to regulate stress was influenced not only by the amount of stress by the child's mother, so like at birth, the amount of stress that the mother experienced during the pregnancy, but also during the life course of the mother herself. So this mediator, this biomarker, was linked, it's linked to like mental health and physical health outcomes, and when there's less of this resource for self-regulation in the offspring. So you can imagine that trauma becomes based on heritage as well. And like what narratives, not only biological, but also what narratives are being passed down when you have family members, or parents rather, who have experienced significant trauma. And you can imagine that a family's history of trauma, for example, like domestic violence, can actually be normalized within the family and within cultures themselves, and passed down biologically through this RSA, or the sympathetic nervous system, or passed on through behaviors and narratives learned about these traumatic events.
Question.
Yeah.
So that would imply that a family member of somebody in a family who has trauma could themselves then be diagnosed with trauma through exposure. I mean, it talks about it's intergenerational, but let's just not even talk about intergenerational. Let's just talk within the family. So, did you see any research in working on this that talked about whether family members, whether trauma can, in that sense, can it be traumatizing to a family member in exposure to somebody with severe trauma, and can they then themselves be diagnosed with?
Right. So when we were talking about interpersonal, we were talking about how a transmission of traumatic symptoms might result in a partner's depression or a child's anxiety. But you're asking, like, can it be PTSD in one generation and then the next generation experiencing symptoms of the PTSD and thus having PTSD themselves?
So, yeah, father comes home from the war, PTSD,
Yeah.
The children themselves.
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is vicarious trauma. which is crucial for not only family systems themselves, but also for us as practitioners, where we are experiencing or having people re-experience their trauma in front of us, and us being exposed to that. Vicarious trauma, although I didn't actually touch on it in this presentation, that's very much a, I think, well-researched thing. It's definitely a well-known thing within practitioners. So yeah.
I would be surprised though if someone could actually be diagnosed with PTSD because of their partner's PTSD. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
that's
to the
pretty
point of
extreme.
yeah, hitting all the criteria or something like that. Yeah.
It would, I would presume that it would have a lot to do with how the person with PTSD copes with and how it ends up manifesting in them, because then if they're traumatizing other people around them as part of how PTSD is showing up in them, creating more trauma in their wake, they have flashbacks and then beat their wife, and now she has her own issues because of the way that that person is reacting. But them having PTSD automatically creating PTSD in the people around them per se is not, I've never heard of anything around that, but I know that it having causing biological changes and that being passed down genetically is something that's been well researched.
Yeah, so you can imagine, which we'll get to this in the social justice section, but you can imagine those with a heritage of severe trauma, indigenous people and colonization of slavery with Black and African American folks. And you have, I think primarily the research for this RSA is done with Holocaust survivors and their offspring. So you can imagine that, the severity, and keeping that in mind when you're with clients.
And epigenetically, like I did my presentation on, as far as anxiety, if you're talking transgenerational trauma, depression, anxiety, whatever is left, whatever leaves a mark genetically, it's not completely reflective of how it'll show in the offspring. So, if it's trauma for a dad, it can be anxiety or depression for the child. There's no forecasting or indicator of how it will manifest in the following generations. It's just mental health issues are likely, but it's going to affect everyone differently.
Yeah. And especially since offspring are usually in sometimes a completely different environment for their parents. And so the environment will inform those more genetic factors and how they are displayed. Yeah. All right. So treatment. Number one question. How do we as clinicians make a severely traumatized person feel totally calm and totally safe? And what's interesting, this is largely research informed by Ileana Gill and Vanderkolk as well. But for Vanderkolk, he really stresses that talk therapy can be very minimal and ineffective, because there's no amount of insight and understanding that can silence the alarm clock or the alarm bell deep within the amygdala, which is what we talked about first. So we need to tap into something that's more profound than language itself. With saying that, there are still relational treatments that we should talk about as relational therapists. So those who took the Families in Crisis course with me, you may remember that Natalia talked about how relationship-based trauma should be healed relationally as well. not just perpetrators and victims, but or survivors rather, but also just in general with survivors of trauma trying to reestablish how it is to relate to each other, to other people. To address relational disruptions that occur in a traumatic event, which we talked about in interpersonal symptoms, and largely these utilize attachment theory. So here are some examples. There's ARC, Attachment, Self-Regulation, and Competency, which this is specifically this is a treatment for family therapy, which addresses childhood complex relational trauma. Does anyone know the difference between like experiencing a traumatic event and complex trauma? Complex is multiple, almost sequential.
Usually goes on for a longer period of time,
It's-
as opposed to a single off event. It's more like living with a drunk parent that comes home every night.
Yeah.
It's a lived experience over time.
Yeah, for sure. It's it's chronic. It's a
So,
chronic experience. of
Childhood
trauma.
sexual abuse that is over a long period of
System.
time, parent abusing the child.
Yeah, that's complex relational trauma. Yeah. So ARC offers an organized multi-level treatment model for complex relational trauma. It's appropriate primarily for situations where the IP is probably between, they say, 2 to 21 actually. And
2?
Yeah. And it has,
That's
right, and so like neglect itself is less, it's more of a chronic not giving
Yeah.
of needs, basic needs. Prolonged exposure to the traumatic event, which we talked about. But it's also important that ARC is used when the family itself is within a safe situation. So it doesn't recommend this kind of treatment, which you can imagine reestablishing attachment ties, starting to self-regulate, and creating cycles of competency, not only within one's individual, but also within the family system itself. Internal family systems is also used. Vanderkolk talks about how some practitioners have used IFS along with ecstasy to also create this feeling of calmness and peacefulness, which allows the individual to revisit their past within their mind, revisit self in a traumatic situation. So hence the different parts of someone, revisiting the part that was traumatized. And it's about reconfiguring old assumptions and associations. So this also requires a fair amount of insight. And yeah. Also, more cognitive behavioral treatment is parent-child interaction therapy, and that's also dependent on the nature of the trauma. And then lastly, something that I thought was pretty cool was strengthening family coping resources, which is a multi-family group model for families who have experienced trauma.
What do you mean multifamily? Like more than one family?
More than one family within a group.
So group
Is it like
therapy with
group?
families.
That's right.
Okay, I was just making, like, not the family that did A, the family that did B, and
No.
session together.
Yeah, no relationship outside of the group. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Who has heard of EMDR? It's kind of Vanderkolk. This is Vanderkolk here. This is a presentation that a lot of he talks about his book, The Body Keeps You Score, which is kind of the basis of this presentation. But he talks about using EMDR or not liking it at first, and then eventually being convinced.
Uh-oh.
Don't wait for me. Don't wait for me.
That's right.
From my understanding, it's
Sounds
not
like
the
I was kinda hung up on
drug
that.
version of
So just like
right.
microdosing of whatever the active ingredients are in.
I didn't go fully into it. That was something mentioned in this presentation. He said a colleague was experimenting with using ecstasy with IFS, which ecstasy, the function of it would be to create to really implement a calm and peaceful, relaxing internal self in order to revisit one's part that has been traumatized.
We were just thinking, why ecstasy, why not marijuana, things like that,
Sure.
that are used already medicinally, and like,
Yeah.
who regulates that? Like, who
Yeah.
just says, oh yeah, it's okay for you to experiment, and at what ages?
Uh-huh.
Like,
I
can they
imagine
just
that it was,
dole it out
yeah.
to whoever they want, teenagers, or?
No, it's
It's a fun fact.
heavily
That's how I
regulated.
presented it.
That is
So I
a
didn't
fun
get into
fact.
much detail with it.
As happened in Boston last 2 months, to help you to dig out your car. And boy, did you see some great use of stress hormones in my part of the world in the last 2 months. Instead of using your stress hormones to do something, you use your stress hormones to become panicked and fearful. And so then
Oh,
Joe says,
well, that sounds recognized.